Everdark, Episode 101, Chosen. Last on Everdark, Christian, Daemon, and Fiona travel deep into the Everdark. They run across two ghosts. Daemon thinks they're a brilliant chance for Christian to train, only the ghosts have other ideas. Now we turn back to Julian and Daemon. "Are you ready?" Daemon asked Julian. Julian drew in a deep breath to calm his nerves.
"If I mess this up..."
"You won't," his master assured him.
"If I do, though, you'll fix it, right?"
Julian turned his face so that he was looking up at Daemon. They were standing by a stand of potted plants and looking out at the second-floor balcony where people milled around. He was to graze on one of them. Not actually feed, just brush his lips across their necks. That would count. This was a game. Julian was jazzed to do it, but his usual cautiousness made him leery of making a mistake. Outing the existence of vampires was a big deal. "Of course," Daemon assured him and put a finger underneath Julian's chin, lifting it. "Now, who will you choose?" Julian nodded and turned back to the group. There were 4 men and 3 women. There was one couple on their own, 2 of the men. Both in their late 40s, elegantly dressed, sipping champagne and speaking desultory to one another as they surveyed the crowd beneath them. Julian touched their minds and received a torrent of images, the 2 of them sailing together in crisp whites, the sun on the water. That was how they had met, and it was still their passion. They had been together for 20 years and had married only 5 years ago. One was in finance, while the other was an artist. The artist still had dried paint underneath his nails. There had been a piece that he had been painting right up until they had to leave for the gala. He was still thinking about it. The texture of the oil paint on the canvas, the scent of linseed oil and old brushes, the colors that were like the rising sun. The financier had an aristocratic nose and fine face with a wiry figure. He loved to run, and he had done a triathlon just the weekend before. The water had been icy, even through the thick neoprene lining of his suit. When he'd been out in that water, he had thought about continuing to just swim until exhaustion took him down. The thought was so powerful and so bleak and so out of step with the mild smile the man had on his face that Julian jerked back physically, even as he removed himself from the men's minds.
"He's dying,"
Julian gasped and felt his cheeks pale.
"He hasn't told his husband yet."
Daemon looked over to the couple and after a moment nodded, confirming what Julian had discovered. "There are several people within this building who will not live past the end of the month," Daemon said. Julian swallowed the suddenly bitter saliva that filled his mouth.
"You can tell that?"
Daemon nodded. "Yes, and more. For example," he pointed at one of the women in front of them in a pale blue dress. "She is coming down with an illness. By tomorrow evening, she will be quite sick, and—" He drew Julian's attention to an elderly man below them with a full head of white hair and very pale grey eyes. "His heart is diseased, and will give out before next week. And then she—"
"Stop!"
Julian closed his eyes. "What is wrong?" "Ah," Daemon asked, then clearly felt what was wrong.
"If I know they're gonna die, then..."
Julian opened his eyelids.
"Then shouldn't we do something about it?"
"You mean turn them?" Daemon's mind was not accessible to him at this moment, and Julian knew that meant that Daemon wanted him to work it out himself.
I know we can't turn everyone. Some people must die,"
Julian said. He realized that Daemon couldn't turn anyone else, otherwise he'd risk them dying a terrible death. Julian wasn't ready to turn anyone. He could feel that. He was too young, not to mention that his blood might kill as readily as Daemon's did. "You are right. Death is a part of mortal life, and we should not interfere in it overly much," Daemon answered mildly. Julian stared at the financier, who gently touched his husband's cheek with the back of one hand. They were so in love even after 2 decades. The fires had not been banked, and the financier wondered what he wouldn't give now to have just a few years more.
"You did just turn all those vampires at Solus back into mortals,"
Julian suddenly said.
"So there are some slots open, aren't there? In a matter of speaking."
"In a manner of speaking, yes. And he might be someone we'd consider. Why don't you go over there and find out if he is a possibility? Not just from your empathy towards his situation, but the person he is, Daemon suggested.
Well, I thought the grazing game was to see how many we could, feed from, or in my case, brush with my lips before they noticed.
Julian laughed. It felt strange to stalk someone that he felt like he had begun to know, especially someone who had limited time left and wanted nothing more than to be alone with their partner. It is. You should do both. If you wish to advocate for someone, you must be in the best position to say who they are, Daemon pointed out.
Right. I can't just ask you to fix it without being sure myself.
Julian nodded.
But how will I be sure?
Daemon smiled. If I were to tell you that you will know it when you see it, I think you would be quite cross with me.
I would be. But I have a feeling that's the only answer you have for me. But surely you can tell if he would make a good vampire.
Julian cried. Yes, but this is something you must learn, and you learn by doing, Daemon said. Julian sighed and scrubbed his face with one hand.
It's funny, but before I met you, Christian said that I would always leap before I looked. Now I'm being more cautious.
You always planned well in advance, Julian, and then you let your instincts lead you. But you trust them, Daemon explained. This is new, and so you don't trust yourself quite yet.
But the only way to learn to trust myself is to do it?
Julian made that sound like a question, but he already knew the answer. He sighed.
Okay.
You can do this, Julian. I will be right here. Daemon gently nudged him out from behind the foliage. Julian drifted over to the couple. He drained half of his champagne in one swallow, even though the alcohol didn't affect him very much. But it was a familiar thing to do. He went to the balcony railing and stood there just a few feet away from him.
Zachary, are you certain you're all right?
It was the artist asking. His voice was slightly thick from alcohol. He'd been drinking because he was certain Zachary was keeping something from him. He didn't know what. Was it an affair? A financial setback? It was bad news of some kind.
Let me get you another glass of champagne. This one's warm.
Zachary had hardly touched the champagne he had. His stomach was not doing well. The doctors had told him to expect nausea. He had actually lost 5 pounds this week. I'm fine, Drew, Zachary assured the artist, even though it was a lie. Julian could feel the man's pain in his bones and joints. Truly.
You're not.
Drew brought down his voice as one of the women nearby had glanced at him sharply.
I can tell.
I'm just a little tired and have a headache, Zachary said, downplaying his suffering. He smoothed his hands down the front of Drew's tuxedo, straightening imaginary wrinkles. He just wanted to touch his husband, feel the warmth and solidity of his chest under his hands.
I've got aspirin in the car. Let me go get you some.
Drew said almost desperately. Zachary was going to tell him no, but Julian touched his mind.
Let him go, then come over and speak to me.
Zachary stiffened, and Julian wondered if all he had done was frighten the other man. But then the stiffness left and Zachary smiled at Drew. All right, bring the aspirin and another glass of champagne. That should set me right.
Oh, good.
The relief that swept through Drew to be doing something, anything to help his husband was so sad. As Drew hurried off, Julian reached for Zachary's mind again.
Now come here.
He felt Zachary hesitate, but then he slowly approached Julian. He leaned on the railing a foot away. Julian felt Zachary's confusion. He found Julian intensely beautiful, but his heart really did belong to Drew. What was he doing coming near this strikingly handsome young man?
Will you tell him?
Julian found himself asking. He hadn't thought to begin this way. He was going with instinct. Hopefully, it wasn't wrong. Pardon me? Were you speaking to me? Zachary gave him an uncertain smile. Julian turned towards Zachary and he could see himself through Zachary's eyes. His skin was pale as marble. His eyes were this incredible purple color that shimmered in the light with red highlights. His lips were stained a deep rose. His hair was dark as night. The tuxedo he wore emphasized his muscled yet lithe figure, and he moved with preternatural grace that spoke of a predator despite his beauty. Zachary was both aroused and a little afraid.
Yes, Zachary, I was speaking to you.
Julian said.
Drew already knows that something is wrong, so you aren't sparing him any worry by remaining silent about the cancer diagnosis.
Zachary's eyes widened. How do you...
No?
Julian realized that this was part of the test. If Zachary fled from him, then he most likely wasn't a candidate for turning. But though the older man drew up straighter, he didn't run.
I know many things, like how you almost swam out into the ocean and never came back last weekend.
You can't know that. No one but me could know that, Zachary whispered. His eyes were filled with shock, but not terror. Julian concentrated as he went from touching Zachary's mind to his body. He had felt how Daemon had done it with the woman with the cold and the old man with the heart condition. For a moment, he didn't see Zachary, but instead saw inside of him. A latticework of veins and arteries appeared over Zachary's body. Organs filled in next, but as lighted outlines, and then he could see the cancer. It was a darkness within the organs. It was swirling through Zachary's blood. It was everywhere.
I'm so sorry about what you're going through,
Julian said.
You've worked so hard to get to this point in your life when things are finally good, and then to find out that it's all going to be taken away, and you didn't even smoke.
Zachary's eyes, which had been as wide as saucers, now narrowed. Do you work at my doctor's office? Or do you hack computer systems and...
I grant you the cancer diagnosis I could have gotten that way, but what was in your head during the triathlon?
Julian lifted his eyebrow at Zachary as if to say, Come on, you know that's not possible. Zachary licked his lips. No, I suppose there's no way you could have hacked me, and that would have been a remarkably lucky guess. Julian realized that making Zachary believe that he could know these things was not useful at this time. It was Julian who had answers that he needed to know.
There's something after this life, Zachary,
Julian said and raised a hand when he realized that Zachary thought he was going to give him a pamphlet. Though really, with what he'd just shown him, if Julian had a pamphlet, maybe it would have been good to take it and read it front to back.
So you don't have to be afraid about turning to dust and nothingness. And don't worry, I'm not telling you to believe in a god for that to be true. It simply is.
We're like the little publisher that could, and do a lot of work for such a small team. Wraith Rain puts out new releases, sales, new art, previews of upcoming stories, and at least 2 free books or manga every month. If you don't want to miss anything, you have 2 options. One is to keep coming back to our YouTube community tab, which we use as a blog for quick announcements and polls. The other is to join our mailing list, where we go into even more detail. The link to both the community tab and our mailing list form is in the notes.
That's comforting, Zachary said, and there was a flare of hope in his mind. He had thought there was nothing. Though I suppose if I asked you how you knew that as well, you wouldn't tell me. Zachary's long, elegant hands were on the railing now. He was watching Julian with fascination. His mind, which had been honed to see beyond the obvious, was taking in the anomalies about Julian. Julian moved too smoothly. There was a coiled grace about him that reminded Zachary of big cats. His eyes were not that color because of contacts. Really, they were becoming quite red.
It's all connected,
Julian admitted. I don't think you're an angel of this afterlife, are you? Zachary let out another uncertain laugh, but he studied Julian's face carefully.
Not an angel,
Julian told him with a shrug. It wouldn't be fair to steal whatever was after from Zachary simply because he feared there was nothing. So a demon? Another laugh. This one was accompanied by narrowed eyes. Zachary was suddenly rethinking his belief system and the existence of demons, which would have seemed ridiculous to him not 5 minutes before, was suddenly quite possible.
Not a demon either,
Julian smiled. So, why are you speaking to me? Zachary asked. He was to the point, and Julian liked this. He was adapting to new facts quickly. That was good too, Julian guessed, for a vampire.
What if you had the power to save someone? Anyone, really, like yourself?
Julian looked down on the partygoers.
What if you could know if someone was sick or dying and could offer them health and eternal life and an existence that was filled with wonder?
Those are heady gifts indeed, Zachary answered. His fine mind, which was used to valuing things, was turning these ideas over. But there must be a catch. There always is. Julian thought of blood drinking. He would have been horrified about it before he'd met with Daemon. But now it was a pleasure. Speaking of his master, he realized that Daemon was listening carefully. His mind held no judgment as to what Julian was doing. This was Julian's show.
There is, but once you've accepted the new life, it won't bother you,
Julian admitted. Zachary rested his elbows on the railings and looked down at the crowd as Julian was doing. And you want to offer this to me?
The truth is that I want to offer it to everyone who is hurt or dying but I can't. That can't be how it is. Only a few can be turned.
Julian explained as he realized just how big a decision this was. Turn. Zachary spoke that word as if he were tasting it. It was familiar to him even though he was not connecting it to vampires. Vampires were like leprechauns and unicorns, wholly made up. He might be believing in demons, but hadn't yet let his mind expand completely beyond the boundaries he'd had before.
There are so many people that need help and would seize this opportunity,
Julian said, more to himself than to Zachary.
I didn't really think of it before, until I came here and was shown how many in this room alone could use the help.
So you can't turn everyone. Not surprising. Overpopulation, I suppose. People must die so that others can live. Zachary, though, did not sound as if he wanted to die himself. Who did? My mother told me on her deathbed that you have to be willing to stop playing at some point. That's the biggest rule of the game of life.
But you're not ready to stop playing. You've just begun.
Julian read his mind. But doesn't everyone think that way? At least those who are struck down young? The bitterness in Zachary's tone was hard to miss. Meanwhile, Julian moved through Zachary's mind. He was not a vegan, which might make him well near impossible for him to feed. He did have a predatory side that came out in his business dealings, but also he had a sense of honor. He had spared a company's pension plan in a takeover. He only really went after those with no mercy who had shown none to others. Julian was sure that he would do the same with vampire money. He could ensure that their investments were handled well. He would be incredibly useful in simply dealing with the wealthy and powerful. He was loyal, as evidenced to his behavior towards Drew and the small circle of friends he adored.
What if you could live, more than live, but Drew didn't come with you?
Julian asked, realizing that Zachary wouldn't be allowed to stay with his husband unless Drew was turned too. Why would that have to be? Zachary's heart beat dully in his chest at that thought, but he wasn't altogether rejecting it.
It doesn't necessarily, but it might,
Julian admitted. I wouldn't want to leave Drew alone, Zachary said, his forehead furrowed.
But you would be doing so if you died.
Julian pointed out. Yes, I suppose that's true. But to go on without him, I suppose that I would be doing that no matter what, too, Zachary said. Again, these answers seemed to indicate that Zachary was a good candidate, but there could be other, better ones. He just met Zachary. This was a limited pool of people. This was all just happenstance.
But Daemon brought us up here to begin the game. That was not a coincidence. Does it mean that Daemon thinks Zachary would be a good fit?
I thought I accepted the diagnosis, Zachary said suddenly. Death. 3 months.
2.
Julian contradicted him as he felt the cancer pulse within Zachary. God. Zachary shut his eyes and swallowed. Realizing what he'd done, Julian reached out but didn't touch Zachary as he said,
I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said.
No, I'm glad to know. I have to put my affairs in order. I have to. Zachary's eyelids shot open and he was staring at Julian with an intensity that only a dying man could muster. Do I have to do that?
Maybe not,
Julian said. He wasn't sure what the threshold requirements were for someone becoming a vampire, but Zachary seemed to have traits he would think would be useful. Zachary grasped Julian's nearest hand in a tight hold. Tell me what I would have to do in order to make that a no. Julian could feel the drive behind this man. He had sensed an opening and he was going to take it, pursue it until the end. Julian had given him hope, and that was a dangerous thing. Zachary thought he was half mad, believing that this strange, beautiful young man could help him. But there was something about Julian that wasn't altogether human. Julian reached into the inside pocket of Zachary's tuxedo and drew out the man's phone. Zachary put his thumb against the reader and opened it. Julian then added Balthazar's phone number.
I'm not going to tell you anything more for now,
Julian said. He sensed Drew approaching up the stairs, juggling 2 glasses of champagne and some aspirin. He felt a stab of pity for Drew, though he might be chosen too.
But when you're ready, call this number.
When I'm ready for what? Zachary pressed. He was still hoping for more information. His logical brain wanted all the facts.
When you're ready,
Julian repeated, knowing somehow that Zachary would have a moment where he'd decided one way or the other to take the leap. Julian then leaned down and lightly brushed his lips over the pulse point of Zachary's throat. He heard Zachary inhale sharply, and the musky odor of arousal flooded the air, along with the slight, bitter scent of fear. Julian drew back and smiled at the man. He touched Zachary's mind once more, somehow knowing that just this touch was enough.
Now go. Have a good time with Drew,
Julian told him. Julian saw himself one last time through Zachary's eyes. Julian looked incredibly unreal, like a dream made flesh. He was nothing like the dull beings that before had seemed so lovely to Zachary's dying mind. Now, Julian seemed to light up the room, but he turned towards Drew, still loving him so much, but part of his mind was still thinking of another life. Daemon's hands were suddenly around Julian's waist. He kissed the side of Julian's neck. That was well done.
Was it? I don't know.
Julian shook himself.
I've given him one more option. An option that will mean he has no peace.
Zachary wants to go on. He is the type to go on. He will mourn Drew if that part of his life cannot continue, but that is a necessary quality of surviving immortality. So you did choose well, Julian. Daemon once more kissed him. Julian turned around in his master's arms, relishing the strength of his touch.
Or were you the one who did the choosing? You brought us up here in the first place. You must have known about him.
Daemon just gave him a half shrug. It was you in the end who came to the same conclusion I did. They started to sway to the music. Daemon spun and dipped Julian before gracefully drawing him back up again. People glanced over at them. Julian could see through their eyes how he and Daemon appeared. They were beautiful, alluring, and again, people thought they seemed unreal somehow. It was then that Julian also realized that Daemon had grazed on all of the other people on the balcony.
You drank from the woman with the cold?
Julian laughed.
She needs her strength, Daemon.
Only a little bit. And I convinced her that it would be good to spend the weekend in bed. Daemon admitted, not repenting at all. Remember, my one, that terrible things happen to mortals all the time. Only we can change their fates.
That's a lot of responsibility,
Julian said. People are in charge every day who do not care at all about the fates of those under their care. Daemon's gaze drifted to a knot of well-dressed people. Julian recognized one of them as the mayor, and another of them was a...
That's a vampire with the mayor,
Julian hissed. More than that, Daemon said with a small smile on his lips. That is a Calais vampire who is still loyal to their immortal. Let's go introduce ourselves, shall we? Join us next time for episode 102, Dig Deep.
If you're in the mood to listen to something really different, I recorded a 3-part short story in 2020 for Halloween. It's called Hero, and it's a gay vampire horror story. Definitely not romance. You can hear my first attempt at a dramatic narration. It's completely open to listen to on YouTube, and I'll post the link in the notes.